Next, Oleg Kalugin, a former Soviet general in the KGB. He talks about his perspective of Soviet history and what led to its breakup. His hour-long speech took place at the Catholic University of America.
Good evening, and welcome to the first in our 4 lectures on the fall of the Soviet Empire and its prospects for democracy in Russia by Oleg Kalugin, a former major general in the KGB, the Soviet Intelligence Service, and political police. I'm your moderator, Dr. Lynn Boucher. I direct the International Political Economy program here at Catholic University. Metropolitan College, of which our program is part, is the School of Continuing and Adult Education. The program in International Political Economy is designed for internationally oriented professionals in business and public policy and international students in economics and political science. Professor Kalugin is currently a resident scholar here at Catholic University of America. He will be teaching a semester-long course beginning in January on the post-Soviet Russian political system. That class will meet once a week here at Catholic University on Wednesday evening. Registration for Professor Kalugin's class is now open. Tonight, his talk is entitled From Lenin to Gorbachev, The Fading Dream. Next Tuesday, November 27th, General Kalugin will discuss the 50-year covert intelligence war. On December 5th, he will analyze the role of the Polish Pope and solidarity in the collapse of communism. Our series will conclude on December 12th with Mr. Kalugin facing the question, will Russia reverse reform? Professor Kalugin's autobiography, The First Directorate, was published in December 1994. The book details the author's career, including service as the Deputy Chief of Mission of the Intelligence Branch at the Soviet Embassy here in Washington, D.C. Born in Leningrad in 1934, General Kalugin's father was an officer in Stalin's NKVD. He attended Leningrad State University and was recruited by the KGB for foreign intelligence work. Undercover, as a journalist, he attended Columbia University in New York. And undercover as a journalist, he was involved in espionage and influence operations. He later served as chief of the intelligence division here in Washington, and then became the youngest general officer in the history of the KGB. General Kalugin's open criticism of cronyism in the KGB caused friction, and he was demoted to serve as deputy chief of internal security in Leningrad. His book recalls that for the first time in his career, he saw that the KGB's internal functions had little to do with state security and everything to do with maintaining a corrupt group of Communist Party officials in power. He resigned from the KGB in 1989 and became a public critic. His vocal attacks on the KGB won him notoriety and a political following. In 1990, Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev signed a decree stripping General Kalugin of his rank, decorations, and pension. General Kalugin then ran successfully in the first and only contested election for the Supreme Soviet and won with the highest single plurality in that election. From that post, he continued his attack on KGB abuses, and following the 1991 putsch, General Kalugin became an unpaid advisor to reformist KGB chief Vadim Batenkin, who attempted unsuccessfully to dissolve the state security apparatus. There will be an opportunity for questions following the lecture. Please join me in welcoming Oleg Kalugin.
Well, thank you, Lynn, for the introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm pleased to face the students' audience again. It was last spring when I met students at this university, and I'm now back again. Hopefully, this series of lectures and my next semester will be fruitful and interesting to all of you and those who did not come today. In the past, over the past several years, the Western public has been inundated by publications and all sorts of exposés of the Soviet regime. All sorts of reminiscences, memoirs, narrations, public television, and whatnot you're all aware of. I think they made public a little bit less interested in the affair, and no wonder today many in the West would turn away from the old problems of Cold War business, about the class struggle, about communism versus capitalism. They are more interested in O.J. Simpson's trial or Princess Diana's private life. Well, but I think this is all trivia. These are all butterfly news. They will fade away, but the substantive issues of world and how it's going to change and what directions the developments of human life will take, this is what will always excite us all and will keep us glued to television and lectures, and everyone who knows not from books but from his own experience how life unfolded in the former communist state, the former Soviet Union, and how it has changed the world and how it failed in the long run and remained as it is today in ruins which are not the end of the problem. Because if you watch closely the international developments, there are elements and signs of revival of the communist ideology, and it's not at all surprising. Let me start from the very beginning. Communism as an ideology was based on many of the Christian tenets, on the principles which were cherished by Christians all over the world, on the concepts of justice, of brotherhood of nations, of peace and equality for all, and abundance for all as a result of human endeavors. And what's more, the communist attraction was based in contrast to Christianity, because the communists promised that this beautiful, just, abundant life will come in our lifetime, not after we die. Well, communism is not of Russian origin, aside from what I have just mentioned. It's based on the best thinkers, philosophers of the epoch of Renaissance, of the French philosophers of the 18th century, those who thought that the new enlightened society will someday crush the system of injustices and will build up a new society, new life for all. This is why when the Russians, for the first time in history, the Russian communists took over by force and violence, by overthrowing a legitimate government of Russia in 1917, they were largely supported by the Russian people, by the people who, let's say, inhabited Russian Empire. And this support lasted as long as the dream of a new system, of a new society, of a new ennobled living will come true. When this dream bumped into problems, when this dream became an illusion, when people finally realized that there would never be better life in their lifetime under communism, that's when the system crushed and fell into pieces. But before it happened, 77 years passed. Before this happened, the Russians and those who followed their example in Eastern Europe or in China, in Vietnam or Angola, in Cuba or Nicaragua, they, for the first time in their lives, experienced that these grand illusions brought unhappiness, brought assassinations, slaughter, mass terror, individual terror, denial of human rights, individual rights. But it took 75 years for the Russian society to realize that their system was based on wrong foundation. I'll give you a somewhat personalized account of this period from Lenin to Gorbachev, because as Milovan Djilas, one of the most prominent critics of the communist regime, said at one time, I was the product of that world. I contributed to it, and now I'm a critic of that world. These words refer to me exactly, because I was one of those who was dedicated to the system, who was dedicated to the ideals of communism. And I contributed to their growth, to their influence, to their propagation across the world. And I have become a critic of this regime because I experienced, as millions of others, maybe belatedly, all the problems and injustices which the system incurred on the people who had faith and who were betrayed by the rulers and communist leaders. Well, as was mentioned, I was born in Leningrad in the family of an NKVD security service officer, petty officer who was not influential in any way. But from the young kids' days, I felt that the system I was educated and brought up was a just system. And look, indeed, in 1917, after the communists took over, a backward, semi-feudal country with bloated bureaucracy, with almost absolute monarchy, developed into a major power where education, science, welfare, and most of all military might became a most striking example how a backward country can surge forward and achieve results really unparalleled in world's history, considering the historic period of the time, only 70 or so years. Indeed, after Lenin died and Stalin, his loyal disciple, took over, things moved in Russia in a relatively correct direction, as they say. We only learned much later about concentration camps, about mass assassinations and terror unleashed by the communists, Soviet communists. But in my time, when I was a kid, when I was a student, as a schoolboy, we were told that these repressions, these mass terror actions were all in response to white guard terror. That the moneyed classes, the bourgeoisie, the imperialist stooges, they unleashed the war against the working class, against the proletariat, and the communists had to respond in kind, using all sorts of violence to suppress counter-revolution. It's interesting that Lenin's image as a founder of the state was never challenged in Russia. You all know about the atrocities committed under Stalin's regime. We all learned about it at a much later stage in our history. But Lenin was beyond reproach. He was an impeccable, a model of a human, a saint who wanted to bring justice and peace to war-torn Russia, to the masses of the people who were deprived of elementary human rights and who lived in abject poverty. Well, it was only much later, in the late 80s and 90s, that we learned that Lenin was not only a founder of the state, but one of the great butchers of the country, the one who initiated the system of concentration camps, the one who exiled intellectuals to the West or killed those who resisted, the one who assassinated or in his orders killed numerous representatives of the Russian clergy and actually pushed the Russian Orthodox Church into underground until they succumbed and decided to cooperate with the state. But this all came later. In the late 20s, when Stalin took over, the process of industrialization started in Russia. A major move by the Communist Party to get Russia out of poverty and out of dependence from the West. This industrialization program was very successful. Successful because it was based on slave labor. And many did not realize that for many years until facts were presented to the world public about millions of Russians who would toil free of payments, but unfree because they were all jailed and lived in Gulag country, who happened to just promote and facilitate the building up of socialism and its very first base, industrialization. When this process was more or less completed, Stalin turned to another project, agriculture. The farmers who never thrived in Russia, who really existed for only a few decades because Russian serfdom was abolished in 1861. And from that period, for about 70 years, Russian farmers or agriculture workers had a chance to develop something of their own. One of the slogans of the Bolshevik Revolution was "land to those who toil on the land." And that's what brought the peasantry of Russia. That's what brought their allegiance and loyalty to the regime. Russia was a peasants' country. It was a country where people were not only illiterate, but who mostly worked in agricultural area. So they believed and they followed Lenin. Stalin decided that an individual farmer, an individual agriculture worker is not the response to the new system. The new system was based on a collective management of all affairs, starting from industrial plants, factories, and now in agriculture. In fact, Stalin introduced a forced system of collective farming, which, has been in existence in the Soviet Union since the late 20s, and in fact continues largely intact till now, in these days, 1995. What happened as a result of collectivization was another major suppression of human rights. Those farmers who had their land and who made it good, by Russian standards, they were all wiped out, exterminated physically, sent into exile, and they would fill up those concentration camps and stay there for years and years, languishing or used as slave labor. By 1934, when collectivization program was more or less accomplished, Stalin felt that he was finally in charge. The country was firmly on this upswing movement towards a more sophisticated, industrialized and agricultural nation. But since Russia was surrounded by hostile states, and the United States was number one, by the way, though America always proclaimed its policies of non-interference and was more isolationist than any European nations, it was America which was the last to recognize the Soviet Union as a state. Germany, England were the first to go and recognize the Bolsheviks. The United States established diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union only in 1933. But by 1934, all the injustices which happened in Russia aroused doubts among many, including communists, about the validity of the political course Stalin undertook. And Stalin, being a suspicious, distrustful character, decided to wipe out opposition whatever means, with all means available. In fact, the year I was born was the beginning of a great purge. Well, actually, the purge developed to its ugliest degree and on a mass scale in 1937. But it was 1934 when one of the contenders to the Russian throne, I mean communist throne, Sergei Kirov, was assassinated in Leningrad, my native city. Well, today many think that he was assassinated on Stalin's order, though proof was never found to corroborate these allegations. But anyway, this assassination was used as a pretext to fight opposition through violence, not through vote, not through persuasion, but through violence. And as a result, the prisons of Russia, the concentration camps, were filled with new millions of opposing elements, of those who did not agree or who had some slightest doubts about the wisdom of Stalin's policies. By 1939, just before the World War II broke out, Stalin actually wiped all opposition. But he also, political opposition, people like Trotsky, Zinoviev, and many others you don't have to remember, were all exterminated physically. Trotsky had to emigrate, and he was finally assassinated in Mexico in 1940. But by 1939, Stalin also managed to get rid of the most professional elements in the armed forces of Russia. Almost 75% of the officers' corps was physically exterminated as enemies of the people, as foes of the state, as spies for Germany, Japan, Romania, Poland, and whatnot. Well, as a young man at that time, as World War II broke out, I was evacuated to Siberia. I was only 7. Russian-German war started in 1941. But I was very acutely aware of what was happening at that time. And let me tell you, by the time I came back to Leningrad from Siberia, where I was evacuated as a member of the security police officer, and hundreds of Russians of a sort of elite party officials and KGB officers and military and many other civilians were evacuated to Siberia behind the Urals, where the German bombing raids would not be able to reach. So when I came back in 1944 to Leningrad, I was barely 10, but I knew that Stalin was the man who could be trusted. Stalin was the man who would bring, and soon victory was on the brink. In 1944, victorious war to the end. With all the doubts which many had in Russia or across the world about the Soviet Union leadership and its ability to manage the country, these doubts were effectively eliminated. Stalin was the winner. The Soviet system was the winner. Of course, the Western powers also participated in this major struggle. Of course, the United States, Great Britain, France at a later stage joined this great alliance and defeated the Germans. But to the Russians and to many communists across the world, the signal was that the communist system was unbeatable. It was simply indomitable. It was the wave of the future. And this is why the communists who managed only to impress thousands in Europe and in Asia before World War II, they managed to capitalize on the victory in World War II. And communism, Soviet style, began its spread across the world. Eastern Europe was #1 target. It was occupied easily by the Soviet troops which were engaged in the war with Germany. And immediately The Soviet-style regimes were instituted in those countries. In some countries at a very early stage, in some a little later, like Czechoslovakia in '48. Then the Chinese Revolution occurred, and this was a great boost to the morale of all communists across the world. All the communists who had some doubts about Stalin's repressive tactics, about the Hitler-Ribbentrop Pact of 1940 when the Russians actually made it possible for Hitler to invade Europe, all this was forgotten because Russia was victorious, communism was marching across the world. And look, Europe had experienced tremendous communist influence in post-war period. In France, there were ministers in the government in the in the 40s, in 45, 46, 47. In Italy, the communists were very close to power. In Greece, there was a civil war because the communists wanted to take over, but, well, Americans intervened and made it impossible for the Greek communists to take over. Now with China becoming a communist power, with East Germany as part of the Russian Empire becoming an East German Democratic Republic, and with new advances of communism in Asia, in Korea, in Vietnam, later in Cambodia, in Laos, the Soviet leadership felt that they were on the right track. Well, there was of course, continuous suppression of dissidents inside Russia before 1953, but not on the scales of the late 30s. Cultural life was suppressed, intellectual life was suppressed. But I think after World War II, many Soviets who were exposed in Europe, be that Czechoslovakia or Poland or Germany, to new unexpected experiences. For the first time, they had a first-hand look at what and how the West lived. Not Western Europe, but Eastern Europe, not very prosperous part of the world. And yet they were astounded by what they saw in Germany. Decent houses, great roads, same in Czechoslovakia, great economic potential, I mean, good living of people despite the hardships of war and post-war reconstruction. So many Russians, and they were millions, those in the armed forces or those who happened to be behind the enemy lines as prisoners of war or just forcefully taken by the Germans to do some heavy work in Germany. These millions came back to Russia, and they saw there was, a definite slowdown in releasing the country's potential, creative potential. This fear, this monopoly of the Communist Party remained intact. Then a great event occurred. Stalin died in 1953. And within 2 or 3 years, the communist leadership, after a stormy and violent, I would say, inner fighting, has propelled Nikita Khrushchev to the leadership of Russia. And in 1956, something occurred, something of historic proportion and importance. Khrushchev delivered a speech at the 20th Party Congress, where he, for the first time, publicly denounced Stalin and the crimes committed against the Soviets, against the ideals they fought for and died for in millions. Khrushchev's speech, you may be surprised because you are younger, was a crucial point in the history of communist movement. For the first time in history, almost 40 years of Soviet power, of Soviet rule, were given a most crucial and analysis, and the one which people could hardly swallow. Stalin turned out to be a butcher. There were mass repressions, there were executions, there was everything, including deportations and genocide against minorities, and the church, and everything was totally subjugated to the one powerful center, Communist Party. And this is where you should understand the nature of the totalitarian state under Stalin, and it was also valid with his successors. They ruled unchallenged. They ruled unchallenged because the power, the ownership, and the ideology were all monopolized by one party, one class. And those who wanted to resist or to deviate or simply to say something critical would simply be, well, simply exterminated. Jailed, exterminated, pronounced psychiatric cases, mentally unstable, exiled. That was the best which occurred to numerous Russians in post-Stalin's era. But 56 was a turning point. The communists across the world were simply stunned by these revelations. In the United States, in Great Britain, in Europe, many turned away from communism. In Russia itself, people started questioning the very foundations of the system, the principles on which the system was based. Well, Khrushchev, of course, was one of the first reformers. And I came to the KGB at the time of the reform. When I was a kid, when I graduated from school, I had this profound faith in Stalin. When I heard Khrushchev's speech, I was, as many Russians, we almost cried, and physically we wept because we thought something was really taken from under our feet, you know. We were simply shaken to the very foundation. But then we thought, okay, there was class struggle. It all fits into the pattern of Marxist ideology. Class struggle, inevitable casualties, victims. It was all in the past. Now the dawn has come. We will now march forward with a new realization that communism is the future of humanity. A noble, lofty society. It's something which we should dedicate our lives to. And I was one of those. And Khrushchev instilled into me this new reborn idea. I was too young to analyze at that time. But Khrushchev's speech opened up new vistas for the young men. And I thought, which is the best organization to promote the cause of communism? Of course, it's either the Communist Party itself or the KGB, the security police, the vanguard of the Communist Party, the very tool of the Communist Party. You know, at that time, I realized, and better than many, because my father was in the system, that the Communist Party and the KGB were the only two organizations in the country which ruled the country. Well, I was I was a good student, let's put it this way, and I was assigned to the intelligence job. And after I graduated from the intelligence school in 1958, I had a great luck of having been sent to the United States as a Columbia University student, School of Journalism. That was on the Fulbright scholarship program. I was one of the 18 Russians ever to see America and to experience new life in this country. Of those 18, practically all were either KGB or GRU officers or co-optees, informers. None would be allowed at that time to travel abroad. This was the system. People could not be trusted unless they pledged allegiance to the KGB or to the party hierarchy. Well, I was lucky enough to recruit inadvertently a young man who worked for a major American company which manufactured solid fuel for missiles. That was in '59. And I was immediately propelled into, in my career because of this unexpected thing which fell into my laps. I was not expected to recruit anyone, but the guy was sort of willing, so why not try? This guy actually helped my career. And I was immediately sent back to the United States, this time as a Moscow radio correspondent at the United Nations. And in this capacity, I served in New York for 4.5 years. Khrushchev was still in power. The thaw in Russia continued. But there were already by that time, by the late 60s, some signs of stall. Something really halted the progress, something in Khrushchev's behavior, something in all environment did not allow things to happen. Indeed, if you recall, there were even ugly events like the Hungarian Revolution of 1956 as a result of Stalin's denunciation of Stalin, and then some events in Poland. But this was all, suppressed. And Khrushchev's finally was overthrown himself by a coup, a violent coup. I mean, not violent really, but a palace coup. I was at that time aware of America, how things are conducted politically in this country, and I was really jarred, by this forceful ouster of a leader who I had faith in. But then we thought, maybe Brezhnev, another guy, he will do it better. Well, Brezhnev ruled for 18 years. And the thought which we thought would, and I thought would someday flourish and thrive and make Russia a more prosperous and more peaceful society, many of these things did not materialize. In 1968, the Soviet tanks went into Prague in Czechoslovakia. And they suppressed this very idea of a thaw, Czechoslovak style. I was, at that time in Washington, and I watched with great interest the developments in Czechoslovakia, and I strongly believe that what at that time had happened in the country would someday affect Russia. And we will certainly move in that direction, and we shall be, with Czechoslovakia building up the new society. All delusions, they stick strong, in one's character. In 68, Czechoslovak Spring was suppressed, killed. But I was very successful. I recruited, or not personally, but I supervised many recruitments. I was deputy chief of the intelligence. John Walker, one of the famous spies who served Russian intelligence for 18 years and who provided us with top classified information on American Navy and submarines and all the coded traffic between the United States Naval Headquarters and all American fleets, Atlantic, Pacific, and others. And other people who, well, you may find in the book, I never mention names, I don't remember. But at least you know the scope of operations, and I was a very successful officer. And this success, this career, of course, sort of a stifled, or sort of made my critical attitude toward what was going on not as critical as it should have been at that time. I was recalled to Moscow in the 70s, early 70s, and was promoted, and became within 3 years the chief of foreign counterintelligence. That's a major institution inside the KGB which deals with all foreign intelligence and security and police organizations, emigre organizations, centers of ideological subversion and other things. We shall talk about it later when we deal with problems of intelligence. I was elevated to become a general at the age of 40, the youngest in KGB history. And indeed, many of the things which I witnessed in my own country were largely from the window of my chauffeured car. I was a member of the Soviet elite. What I read about the hardships of the people I never experienced myself. What I read in the media in the West, I knew there was half propaganda because it was deliberate to undermine and weaken the Soviet system. There were two books, though, which I read in my younger days and which made me think a little bit differently. One book was by Arthur Koestler, Darkness at Noon, a novel, but it has such a tremendous impact on me because for the first time in my life I realized how people suffered for the idea and how they were willing to die for the idea. But they were suffered unjustly. And that was really a drama of many Soviet communists and revolutionaries. And then I read Milovan Djilas's New Class, another book which gave me an insight into the system, not so much from factual standpoint, but from the standpoint of philosophical observations and analysis of the system, its weaknesses, and its inevitable doom and destruction. That I say I was a successful officer. It was okay. By 1980, I was a very successful man. But the country was going to the dogs. Brezhnev turned out to be a man who was not incapable of managing the country's economy, social affairs. His slogan was, let's live and let others live. That was a great slogan because this is exactly when Russian crime wave, hidden until recently, became creeping into the country's fabric and organism. Because people at the top were corrupt. And since the people were allowed to live the way they wanted, everyone was starting stealing, embezzling, and doing how he could. The system was decaying because it could not provide people with the abundance promised in the many decades ago. Because the system could not produce anything new. Education, health care, housing, science, cultures, something which we were proud of, was also degenerating slowly. There were some flickers of hope. There were some signs of resistance. But the country was slowly going down the hill. And that was clear to everyone who wanted to see. And I had to see it because I was in the position. But my really new awakening to the system and to its flaws and crimes really occurred only after I was transferred to serve in the domestic security police. In the intelligence, as you understand, I was involved with foreign affairs. I mean, what happened in the United States, in China, Australia, Peru, that what was of my interest, not what happened in Russia. In Russia, I was all right. But one thing which you have to understand, and this is what is very important part of my personal change. If a person reads books, watches films, listens to propaganda, it may be absolutely useless and ineffective unless he himself becomes a part of this system, unless he experiences the things which propaganda and books and films try to profess. In fact, I would say no one can be impregnated unless he has the personal experience. And I had that personal experience in 1979, when the guy I recruited many years ago in '59, that very American engineer who propelled me in my career, who was imprisoned by the Soviet security police on the suspicions of having been a CIA agent, the man who I befriended, the man who I recruited, the man who I seduced and took to Russia eventually because the FBI was after him, this man was jailed, and I was the man who was the culprit. This was the dilemma I faced in the late 70s when in Moscow. And I was so emboldened or brazen in my behavior at that time. I thought what I was doing was right. I was critical of the system, but in private circles. But when I saw injustice done where I myself was personally involved, I had to make a choice. And this is the choice which I made largely, and partly maybe largely, because of the man who you know very well, Martin Luther King. Because he was the man who said many years ago that if you live until 38, as he was at that time, and you see that that injustice is around, that's, people are not treated well, that there is coercion, there is something, and you do not say anything in defense of people who suffer, then you are simply dead, and the announcement of your death will come later, physical announcement. But spiritual, as a man, you are dead. If you are afraid that your house will be bombed, that your kids will suffer, and you do not stand up and say something in defense of truth, then you are a finished man. And that was the moral dilemma which I faced, and I decided to go ahead. I said to Andropov, who was my benefactor and leader of the KGB at that time, I said, the man you imprison is innocent. He is a victim of injustice of the KGB. Well, the man was brought from prison, and I interrogated him on Andropov's order. And I said, listen, confess that you're a CIA spy. And the man wept and said, I hate the day I met you, the KGB, and everyone, what you did to me. I never was a CIA spy. Do you want me to hang myself to prove? And that was the most dramatic moment in my life. That very personal experience I'm talking about, the one which changed my life. Then I immediately recalled the thousands and millions of Russians, Soviets, and others who were imprisoned innocently, who were killed, exterminated on the KGB orders. And I was part of this system. And I was one who brought unhappiness to the people. This particular one put them thousands of others who lived in similar conditions. Well, when I protested, I was the first KGB senior officer to challenge the system. I was immediately relieved of my duties in Moscow and sent to Leningrad, my native town, as the first deputy chief of the regional counterintelligence. Well, it was a nice job. It was an honorable exile. But I say, and Lynn mentioned this was a really discovery of my own country. Now I finally immersed myself into the political system, mechanism, kitchen of the Soviet political thought and practice. And I was absolutely abhorred by what I saw. I was simply disgusted with what I saw. Corruption, hypocrisy, lies, cheating, I mean everything, the worst of kind, which I never expected from the people who I had great faith in and who I thought were the leaders of my country, you know, leading us to the brighter future. No, they could never take us to a brighter future. They were all crooks, to say the least. And criminals too. And, well, how could I fight these guys, you know? The whole system was serving them. And I, as a KGB officer, I did not protect my country's security. I protected my leaders' personal safety and security. And this is when the old books and articles and many things I read in my life all came to my mind again, and I said, listen, I was wrong all the time. There was something wrong, basically wrong in this society. It has to be changed. If you recall, when Brezhnev died, Russia was in shambles. Not because they wept, because they felt abandoned. Not by Brezhnev, no one cared about him, but they felt betrayed. Then other people came, Chernenko, I mean, people who you don't have to remember, you know, nobodies. And then finally, Gorbachev, 1985. I thought I was dead by 1985. I thought I would never, well, retirement was not too far away, and I thought someday. Well, Gorbachev came to power, and as he started his new course of perestroika, I felt again a new man. I thought not everything is lost. And maybe communism can, after all, be, well, resurrected as an idea. Maybe we could go ahead and do what we could. But Gorbachev, who is of my generation, who was born at about the same time, and who experienced many things which I did, but in a different way, he also realized too belatedly that communism will never work. But if you look at his pronouncements of 1986, he would pledge to be a loyal communist. He would say that I'm a socialist. Communism is a future of our country. He was proud of the achievements of the country. But then slowly, gradually, Gorbachev started to change himself. It was partly due to the mood of the country. He had to succumb to the sentiments of the people, to many professional intellectuals who said to him, the country must be reformed. There were other reasons. The Russian economy was completely stalled by 1982, 83. The Russian economy was almost ruined by military burdens, and President Reagan's Star War program made it impossible for the Russians to carry on in their race with America. It was clear that the system will simply collapse someday. So Gorbachev wanted to save the system. But he was like Christopher Columbus, who set out for an unknown destination one day, hoping to see India. Instead, he discovered America. That's exactly what happened to Gorbachev. But in 1985, I embraced him with all my heart. And I tell you now, he's gone. I still have a great respect for him. In fact, I saw him just 6 weeks ago in Moscow. And we talked at length about the future of Russia, because he's a great man. But this is something we'll talk about later, not probably today. But it was clear at that time that the change was imminent. But no one foresaw the change which occurred. The Russian society by then was ripe for a change. It matured enough to understand that communism was not the way of the future. However great and bright the ideal may be, you cannot build up a just society on the millions of human bones. You cannot enforce an individual to be happy by the decree of the Politburo or the decision of another central party central committee plenum. It was too clear. The country was in a profound crisis, economic, social, intellectual, moral, everything was falling apart. And Gorbachev suggested the way out. Well, Gorbachev did not last long, as you know. Gorbachev failed because he was too dedicated to these old ideas, and he was too hesitant, too unsure about his next moves. He was finally overthrown by his KGB, lieutenants. It was a sheer miracle that he survived. By then, in 1987, when I felt that Gorbachev was the right man, I wrote a letter to him. I stamped it top secret. And in this letter, I said, "My dear Mikhail Sergeyevich, if you do not destroy KGB as the main pillar of Soviet society, they will destroy you." That was the message. He never heeded the message. And he was almost overthrown in August of 1991. It was only 10 days after he came back from his exile in the Crimea. He met me in the Kremlin. I was a member of the Soviet Parliament at that time, elected by 1.5 million people who did not accept the idea that I was a traitor to my country. And he met me and he said, "Oleg," well, he apologized. And I told him that I will support him all the time because I knew he was on the right track. But, well, history did not allow him to proceed. Well, as you know, Yeltsin came to power, and with his image, his name, many Russians thought their old dreams will materialize. They never did, and they won't under his rule. But this is another problem we shall touch upon later. Well, that's it for today. Well, you are welcome with your questions. Please do not hesitate to ask any question. Well, okay.
Yes. Sir, in your descriptions about the communist system, I see my country had been dealing with a political system like yours. So, do you think by the times, François Duvalier, to quote Papa Doc, and Haiti had taught by your system? One. Second, I had been read somewhere that a KGB agent is a KGB agent what is the best way for an agent to collect information?
What is the best
The best way
way
for an agent to collect information?
Well, it's to penetrate very deeply inside the political, economic, military institutions of the country. And to start this penetration, you have to befriend people. To befriend, number one, to pay money if they are in need, to help their relatives if they are sick. I mean, you know, that's a whole textbook on how to manipulate people. But this is not a Russian or Soviet or communist textbook. It's based on this human centuries of history of intelligence work. The Russians or the Soviets were very strong because they were guided by ideology which attracted so many people. In fact, their best inroads into the Western security were made largely because people had faith in their espionage, because they thought they were fighting for a cause, undermining Western governments. Take people like Kim Philby, for instance, the man who was part of the establishment, but he hated the establishment, and he wanted to help Soviet communism spread over the world, including his own country. So they were the best loyal ones. But the other tricks or methods of operation by the KGB or any other security service, they are about the same. Well, but penetration is the best way to conduct an intelligence and to have a more or less precise assessment of what's going on in the world or in a particular country. Yes, please. No more questions? Yes, please.
Do you feel that problems you saw in the KGB are similar to the current problems the CIA is having with the mentality of, cronyism, of getting in trouble, of not being able to have new leaders put in, and the actual agents or people who've worked there not supporting them or believing them or cooperating with them?
Well, there is a great similarity between the plight of the CIA today and that of the old KGB. The reasons are obvious. These organizations thrived in Cold War time. They were simply in the forefront of this Cold War battle. Now that the Cold War is over, their usefulness has declined, and as a result they are oversized, and they have lost their main goal, their mission of fighting, combat their arch enemies on the other side. Who are the arch enemies of the United States today, or Russia? Well, of course there are some enemies like unruly people of like Libyan leader or Iraqi leaders or Iranian leaders or terrorists. That's okay, but this is not a life or death problem. In the old days, the struggle against communism was a matter of survival for the West, not because of the influence or power of Russian or Soviet doctrines, but because of the nuclear Russia and nuclear communist power. That's where the danger lied, and this is where all the CIA and KGB took advantage of. Now that these threats are gone, I mean, worldwide conflict and nuclear annihilation, well, these agencies have lost much of their meaning. No, this is not to say that they have to be disbanded, not at all. But it's true, cronyism still is very much a matter of their, of their life. Their mentality is Cold War mentality. I mean, a mentality of a country, in Russia particularly, who ruled without, laws. They were just would do as they pleased. In this country, remember Watergate, the CIA was also involved in some unlawful operation against the citizens of this country and not against the foreign personnel. So now that all these problems seems to be, away, these services are certainly undergoing a tremendous reassessment and crisis of great proportions. Yes, please.
Do you believe that the KGB is lying dormant now and waiting to make some moves around President Yeltsin and his perceived weaknesses?
Well, the KGB has been disbanded as the powerful tool of the party. It has been actually split into 5 autonomous organizations. That happened in 1991, right after the unsuccessful attempt to oust Gorbachev. And I was, by the way, one of the advisors at that time, and I thought this kind of dismemberment of the organization was very useful, because this would simply cut their powers. But unfortunately, in Yeltsin's times, they have started regrouping and resurrecting their old powers. They are not as strong as they used to be, but they wish to be that strong. They wish to again to monopolize the country's security and intelligence system. Unfortunately, Yeltsin is greatly influenced by his chief security guard, a man, a personal protege, and a man who is number 2 in Russia's politics today. And with this man as number 2 in Russian politics, you can imagine he can afford many things others would not be able to. And this is where really people in Russia and elsewhere are worried that the KGB, or whatever it's called now, may someday regain its old powers. Well, I hope it will not happen in my lifetime, and never again, because the Russians have learned their lesson. Hopefully they will not allow this to happen. And next year, when we have presidential elections, and Yeltsin is not going to be elected, and his bodyguards are not going to be around. So that's the hope, unless they, unless they undertake some actions prior to the election. But that's another thing, which is a guesswork. We'll see how things unfold in Russia soon. Yes, please.
You spoke about your idealism when you were younger, and then your later disillusionment. Do you feel completely alone among the upper circles?
Oh, no. Well, let me say that Gorbachev was one of those who lost illusions, but he was groping. He did not know where to go. Well, in 85, I, like Gorbachev and like millions of other Russians, felt that the system was not effective, was not working. But it had to be changed, perfected, made more competitive, made more attractive, made more prosperous, based on the same principles. It later developed that the principles themselves, were not valid. They were not working, The ideals are great, but the modus of operandi was absolutely, unacceptable and was wrong. Well, if that's all, then I hope.
I have a last one.
Okay.
I see you are a very minded person. And you have an idea, like an idea of the Communist Party or the KGB. What is the good side of the communism?
Well, the good is its idealistic approach to human problems. Its promises that justice and brotherhood of nations and people will come in our lifetime. That's what made them attractive. There is nothing else in communism which made that attractive. Well, there is one thing, though. I would be dishonest if I did not mention that. In the old Soviet regime, there have been some social gains, and I mentioned them. Free health programs, inadequate but free. Housing, very bad but very low rent. Medicine, education, free. Well, good education, but in certain fields. Well, these gains were made largely at the expense of people's, well-being. People would live like slaves in many ways. They would not be allowed to travel. They would not be allowed to choose their residences. They would have to work in every state-owned enterprise, and they would never be able to say a word of criticism if something went wrong, because they would be then suspected of, conducting alien propaganda. So you have to weigh which is better: to live like a slave. You will be fed every day. You will be taken to a job by a boss, maybe. And then come back to your barracks and survive. Subsistence level, but it was always all right. You will be treated if you are sick, because you are needed as a working force. So I think this system inevitably would fail, because the humans deserve a much better and superior treatment than that.
Thank you very much, General Kalugin.
Thank you. Thank you all.
As I indicated earlier, General Kalugin will be speaking again next Tuesday night here at Catholic University at 7 p.m. The topic next week will be the 50-year covert intelligence war. That will be the second in a series of 4 lectures. Next semester, General Kalugin will be teaching a class entitled The Political Future of Post-Soviet Russia. Registration for that class is open. We thank all of you for coming tonight and hope our viewers on C-SPAN enjoyed the lecture and that we will be seeing you again also. Thank you and good night.
Thank you. Okay, is that yours? No?
No.
No?
Watch the Russian Evening News weeknights on C-SPAN at 2 a.m. Eastern Time and on our companion network C-SPAN 2 at 8 p.m. Eastern Time.